Hello and welcome to Psych Boost. In this video we'll be looking at Shaffer's stages of attachment, and we'll also be talking directly about the role of the father in childhood development. So we'll discuss Shaffer's 4 stages and focus on infant-father interaction. Some key terms will be asocial, indiscriminate, specific, multiple attachment, and when we talk about fathers we'll mention the role of play. We'll have some evaluative research and ways we can extend our evaluations. So let's start Shaffer's stages of attachment. Researchers Shaffer and Emerson did a longitudinal study, and I'll mention this longitudinal study in the next part of the video. But from completing this study, Shaffer and Emerson were able to identify 4 distinct phases of attachment. They named them asocial, indiscriminate, specific, and multiple. So let's start with asocial. This is also known as the pre-attachment stage, and it starts from birth to about 6 weeks. Now for the first few weeks, baby responds to humans in a way similar that they respond to objects, and they'll just generally smile at them. Now babies do seem to be more content with certain individuals, but there certainly doesn't seem to be an actual attachment at this point. Now from about 6 weeks, we're going to reach the indiscriminate attachment, or sometimes called the diffuse attachment stage. Indiscriminate means you're not picking between one or another, and this means the baby can be handled by a range of strangers. They won't necessarily cry when held by someone new, but they will discriminate between familiar and unfamiliar individuals with a preference for familiar adults. But what's important about this stage is they don't have separation anxiety, so when mum leaves the room, they won't cry. And they don't have stranger anxiety, so when they're left with the stranger, they don't get too upset. Now what happens in the next stage is specific or discriminate attachment, and this is from about 7 months onwards. At this stage, separation and stranger anxiety starts to develop. Mum leaves the room, the baby will start crying. A stranger enters, the baby will get a little closer to mum. The baby is left alone with a stranger, the baby will start crying. At this point, the baby will tend to have a clear preference to one primary caregiver, or maybe 2, but generally it'll just be mum. Now at some point, the child will go beyond this discriminate attachment stage, and they'll move into the multiple attachment stage. Now attachment is shown not just to mum, maybe it'll also be dad and brothers and sisters and grandparents, and this generalised fear of strangers will start to decrease over time. So those are Shaffer's 4 stages of attachment. Let's look at that piece of research. So this is 1964 and it was called the Glaswegian baby study. So data on these babies were collected over the course of the year in monthly observations as well as interviews with parents. So they visited 60 babies and their families over the course of this year, and they also did a follow-up visit at 18 months. When they were observed, 2 types of behaviour were looked at: stranger distress and separation anxiety. So stranger distress is when there's signs of discomfort to a new person, to a stranger. So what this shows is an ability to tell the difference between familiar and unfamiliar people. Separation anxiety, so a showing of discomfort when the caregiver goes to a different room. This shows the development of an attachment bond. So what was found with these babies? Well, separation anxiety happened first, and it happened in the majority of the babies between 25 weeks and 32 weeks. Generally later on, stranger distress would occur, generally about a month later. But by the 18-month follow-up, 87% had developed multiple attachments. But generally the strongest attachment was still to the mothers. And another finding was the strongest attachment shown was to those mothers who seemed to give the most consistent caregiver-infant interaction. So what might this research mean? Potentially, as we see a pattern of development happening generally in predictable stages in all babies, maybe there's a biologically controlled process that babies have to go through. What it also suggests is the quality of the caregiver-infant interaction in those first few weeks of life goes on to have a direct impact on the strength of attachment between the mother and their child. Okay, so this study has some criticisms we can give it. This sample's population was not representative of most people in the world. They were a working class group of mothers in 1960s Glasgow. So because it was the 1960s, we might say it lacks temporal validity. Child rearing practices are very different now than they were 50 years ago. And Glaswegian culture isn't representative of the UK as a whole, and certainly not the entire world. So we're certainly lacking some external validity in this study. But a positive is the way this was carried out does have a high level of mundane realism. The families were visited in their own homes, and the babies would be used to strangers visiting occasionally. so the therapist coming in wouldn't have created any extraneous variables. And also, caregivers often have to leave the presence of the infant. It's not an unusual task for the experimenter to ask the parent to do. Also, by including an aspect of self-report for the parents, Shaffer and Emerson strengthened their study by using two different research methodologies and finding the same thing. This is a process called triangulation. Onwards to the role of the father. The first thing we can say about the role of the father is, based on research from Shaffer and others, it seems the role of the father is less important than that of the mother. Shaffer found that the children's primary attachment figure was most of the time mum. This was 65% of cases. In 30% of the cases, mum was still a primary attachment figure, but there also might have been another person. This could be dad, but it also could be a sibling or a grandparent. Only in 3% of the babies that Shaffer and Emerson investigated was the primary attachment figure dad. Now, we might argue this could be due to cultural and temporal reasons I spoke about a moment ago. It could just have been a feature of 1960s working class Glasgow, but there might be biological reasons that males, fathers, play a less important role. But let's stick with culture. There is now changing cultural roles in society. We might argue in modern Western society, mothers and fathers' roles have adapted significantly. Mothers are far more likely to go out to work, and that means that fathers have to step in on taking some of the caring roles that often would have fell just to the mothers. Now, this is quite likely to have a significant impact on the attachment patterns of these infants. Something else we could mention about the role of the father is, when observed, fathers are tend to seen as engaging in play more than mothers are. So when we look at fathers' interactions, they will emphasise stimulation. They'll be encouraging risk-taking behaviours, say perhaps taking the first steps. And we've compared these to mothers' interactions. Generally, mothers tend to take a more comforting style of interaction. They'll tend to soothe the babies. As mentioned above, generally women still perform the role of primary caregivers. But there does seem to be evidence to suggest that if men take on the role of primary caregivers, their interactional style will change to be more like mothers. So a higher level of sensitive responsiveness to the child's needs. A piece of research that highlights fathers' roles in the development of children is by Versimo and other researchers in 2011. So in this research, observations of preschool children's relationships with their mothers and fathers were assessed. And then these observations were compared with a follow-up assessment when the children started at nursery. What they found was a strong attachment to the father was actually the best predictor of the ability of these children to go on and make friends in school, suggesting there is an important role for fathers in the socialization process of their children. So let's evaluate this area of psychology. This research on the importance of the role of father in social development, and findings that males can take on a more maternal role, might provide confidence to many fathers who are taking on this role of primary caregiver, perhaps while their partner returns to work or some other situation. Also, there are more single gender families. Research showing that people can switch their parenting style could give them more confidence in raising their children. A criticism I mentioned in the previous video, but applies here, is infants can't communicate their thoughts and emotions. Research like Shaffer and Emerson's are based almost entirely on inferences on internal mental states of these infants based on observations of the infant's behaviour. Now, this is unscientific, and certainly in Shaffer's and Emerson's study could have resulted from observer bias. Shaffer and Emerson only used one observer at a time on home visits, and recordings simply weren't possible at that time, so we can't review their observations. Another criticism, again used before but can be used again, is the concept of social sensitivity. When we talk about child rearing techniques or stages of development, some women might find that their life choices are going to be criticised in some way. Perhaps they decide to go to work. They might worry if they feel they're the primary attachment figure. Or men that decide to take on the role of primary caregiver might feel that they're biologically not capable of providing the same function as a woman, especially if the evidence seems to show most women fit the role of primary caregiver. I really hope you found this video useful in studying psychology. 3 things help this channel grow a lot: likes, comments and subscriptions. Thank you so much if you've done any of those things for this video.